My daughter accidentally forgot to hang up, and I heard she needs to go to a nursing home. I said nothing and silently sold the house for $990,000. Changed the will, but when she found out there would be no inheritance. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who sat alone in her kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, replaying a phone call over and over in her mind like a broken record. But that's exactly where I found myself on a Tuesday in October, with a cup of chamomile tea going cold on the table and my hands folded in my lap, very still, the way hands get when the rest of you is trying not to fall apart. Let me tell you how things were before all of this, because there was a before, and it mattered. My name is Margaret Callahan. Most people who love me call me Peggy. I'm 74 years old, and until that October evening, I believed I had done a reasonable job of building a life worth being proud of. My husband, Frank, passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, quick and merciless. And after the grief settled into something I could carry, I found that I actually liked living alone. Not in a bitter way, in a quiet, self-sufficient way that surprised even me. I kept a garden. I cooked real meals. I had my neighbor Dorothy over for cards on Thursdays, and every Sunday I drove myself to street. Michael's sat in the third pew from the left and felt something close to peace. My house on Clover Hill Road was paid off, had been for 15 years. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a backyard maple tree that Frank planted the year we moved in. The county assessor had it valued at $990,000 the previous spring, a number that still made me blink. We'd bought it for $62,000 in 1979. That's the kind of math that makes you understand what a lifetime looks like on paper. I had 2 children. My son, Robert, lived in Portland with his wife and their twin boys. We spoke every Sunday after church without fail. And then there was Diane. Diane was my daughter, 48 years old, married to a man named Todd Briggs, who sold commercial insurance and had the handshake of a man who needed you to trust him immediately. They lived 20 minutes away, in a newer development with a homeowners association and a community pool that nobody used after September. Diane came by once or twice a month, usually on Saturdays, usually with a casserole dish of something that reheated well. I appreciated the gesture. I always had. But I want to be honest now, the way you can only be honest after the fact. There had been signs. Small ones. The kind you explain away because the alternative explanation is too uncomfortable to sit with. It started, I think, the previous spring. Diane began asking questions about my finances with a frequency I hadn't noticed before. How was my pension holding up? Had I thought about whether the house was too much to maintain on my own? Wasn't the yard getting to be a lot of work? Each question on its own was reasonable. A daughter concerned about her aging mother. That's how I filed them, one by one, in the drawer of reasonable concerns. Then in August, she brought a brochure. She set it on the kitchen table next to my coffee cup, with a casualness that felt rehearsed. Sunrise Gardens Senior Living Community. Full-service amenities. Supervised care, structured activities. I looked at it. I said, "That's very nice, Diane." I didn't pick it up. She didn't push, but she left it there, and I noticed she didn't take it with her when she left. In September, Todd started coming along on the Saturday visits. He'd never done that before, not consistently. He would walk through the house with his hands in his pockets, pausing in doorways, looking up at the ceilings the way contractors do. Once I caught him standing in the backyard, just standing there, looking at the maple tree and the property line, and there was something in his expression I didn't have a name for yet. And then came the Tuesday in October. Diane had called at 7 in the evening. A normal call. She asked if I'd seen the doctor about my knee. I said I had an appointment next week. We talked about Robert's boys starting Little League. She said she had to go start dinner, and we said goodbye. And I heard the sound of a call ending, except it didn't end. I realized it after a moment of silence. The call was still connected. The phone hadn't hung up properly on her end. I could hear the ambient sounds of her kitchen, the clatter of a pan, and then Todd's voice, closer, asking how the call went. And I heard Diane say, clear as anything, same as always. She's fine, stubborn as ever. And Todd said something I couldn't quite make out. And then Diane said, and I have heard these words every night since. I have heard them in my sleep. She needs to go into a home, Todd. The sooner the better. That house isn't going to sell itself, and we are not waiting another 5 years. I sat very still. I did not hang up. I listened for another 40 seconds, long enough to hear Todd say, "What about Robert?" And Diane say, "Robert's in Portland. Robert doesn't need to know everything." Then the call ended. A real ending this time. I put the phone down on the table. I looked at my cold chamomile tea. I looked at my hands, and I thought, so that's what this has been. I didn't cry. I want to make that clear. Not because tears would have been weakness, but because there were no tears. Just a kind of cold, spreading clarity. The way a winter morning looks before the sun is fully up. Everything sharp. Everything still. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The maple tree in the backyard moved in the wind, just slightly, the way it always did. I'd looked at that tree from this window for 45 years. Frank had planted it as a sapling, barely taller than our Diane was at the time. And now Diane wanted to sell the land it stood on, and I was supposed to go quietly into a building with scheduled meal times and a cheerful activities coordinator and never come back. I thought about the brochure she'd left on my table. I thought about Todd in the backyard, his hands in his pockets. I thought about every question she'd asked me about money over the past 6 months. And I laid them out in my mind one by one, like evidence. Because that's what they were, weren't they? Not concern. Evidence. How long had this been the plan? I'm a practical woman. Frank used to say that about me, and he meant it as the highest compliment. While other people were still reacting, Peggy was already figuring out what to do next. Grief hadn't broken that in me, and neither would this. But I will admit, and I think honesty matters here, because if I'm going to tell this story, I'm going to tell it truthfully. I was afraid. Not the sharp, immediate kind of afraid. The slow, settling kind. The fear of being made helpless. The fear of being managed. The fear that at 74, in a legal and logistical world I didn't fully understand, my own daughter might be able to do exactly what she intended, and there might be very little I could do about it. Could she force me into a facility? I didn't know. I was in good health, mentally sound, living independently. But I'd heard enough stories. A doctor's opinion here, a legal filing there, a family member with power of attorney who decides the time has come. I had no idea what tools Diane might be gathering quietly, the way she'd been gathering everything else quietly. And the not knowing was its own kind of fear. I slept badly that night, and the next morning I did what practical women do. I made a list. Not a list of grievances, a list of questions. What did I actually own, and in what form? What was my legal standing? Who knew about my situation, and who could I trust? What would Diane's strategy likely be, and what were its weak points? I knew the house was mine, free and clear, in my name alone. Frank's name had come off the deed 8 years ago when we'd updated our estate planning after his diagnosis. The house was mine to sell, rent, gift, or leave to whoever I chose. Diane had no legal claim to it while I was living, That was one solid thing I could stand on. I also knew that my will, last updated 11 years ago when Frank was still alive, left the house equally to Diane and Robert, with the personal property divided the same way. A will made when I believed my children were equal partners in my life. Before I understood that one of them had been conducting a quiet audit of my assets and making plans that didn't include asking my opinion. I needed a lawyer, not the family attorney who'd handled Frank's estate. He was a friend of Todd's golf partner, a detail I now found deeply uncomfortable. I needed someone with no connection to Diane's world, someone I found on my own. I also needed to understand the house's actual market position. The county assessment was nearly $1 million. But what would it actually sell for? And how quickly? I wasn't thinking of selling yet, or I wasn't admitting it to myself yet. But I needed to understand what I held. I drove to the library that Thursday morning. Dorothy, my card-playing neighbor, asked if I wanted company, and I said no. I had some research to do. I used the library computer. I have my own laptop. But something made me want this particular search to happen somewhere other than my home network, and I'm not sure I could have explained exactly why, except that I was beginning to think carefully about what left traces. I searched for estate attorneys in the county. I wrote down 3 names, offices far enough from our neighborhood that I was unlikely to run into anyone I knew. I searched for real estate market values on Clover Hill Road. I found that 2 comparable properties had sold in the past 18 months. One for $980,000, one for just over $1 million. My house, in its current condition, would likely be competitive. I sat with that number for a while, and then, slowly, a thought began to take shape. Not a full plan yet. Just a direction. A first step that could become a second step that could become something Diane had not anticipated at all. What if I sold the house first? Not because I wanted to leave. I didn't want to leave. But what Diane was planning to do with my home was predicated on one assumption: that it would still be mine to inherit when I was gone. That I would go quietly into Sunrise Gardens and the house would sit, and eventually it would pass to her. But I was alive. I was mentally competent. I was the sole owner of a piece of property worth close to $1 million. And in the state of Ohio, a mentally competent adult can sell their own property to whoever they choose for whatever reason they choose. And they do not need their daughter's permission. I drove home from the library in the October light, the maple trees along the road all going gold and red. I thought about Frank. I thought about what he would have said. He would have said, "Peggy, don't get mad. Get organized." So I got organized. I called the first attorney on my list the following Monday morning. Her name was Patricia Oakes, and her office was in Worthington, a 30-minute drive, in a building with a parking garage where I felt reasonably sure Diane's friends wouldn't spot my car. I told the receptionist I needed to discuss estate planning and a potential property transaction. They gave me an appointment for Wednesday at 2 o'clock. I didn't tell anyone I was going. Not Dorothy, not Robert. Not yet. Robert didn't know any of this was happening, and I needed to understand the full picture before I involved him. He had a good relationship with Diane, or believed he did, and I didn't want to say things that couldn't be unsaid until I was certain of what I was dealing with. The drive to Worthington on Wednesday was pleasant. One of those Ohio autumn days that makes you forgive the state for February. I found the office, found parking, and sat in the waiting room with a magazine I didn't read. Patricia Oakes turned out to be a woman in her early 60s, compact and calm, with the particular manner of someone who has spent decades listening to families describe their complications without surprise or judgment. I liked her immediately. I told her everything: the phone call, the brochure, Todd in the backyard, the questions about money. I told it all in order, the way I'd organized it in my head, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Callahan, you are in a strong legal position. You are competent, healthy, and the sole owner of your property. No one can compel you to move, sell, or alter your estate without your consent." She paused. "The concern I would flag is a future guardianship or conservatorship filing. If a family member petitions the court claiming you lack the capacity to manage your own affairs, that process can be difficult, even when the claim is entirely without merit." "How do I protect myself from that?" I asked. "Documentation," she said. "A current cognitive evaluation from your physician, a clearly stated and witnessed expression of your wishes. And if you're considering selling the property, doing so promptly through proper channels removes the primary asset from the equation." We talked for an hour and a half. Before I left, I had retained her officially. I'd written a check. She was my attorney. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt since October, a sense of solid ground. Now, the direct evidence. It came, as these things often do, from an unexpected direction. The following Saturday, Diane came by as usual. She brought a pan of lasagna and seemed, to my eyes, to be watching me more carefully than before. I had made a decision to behave exactly as I always did. I offered coffee. I asked about her week. I admired the lasagna. I was the same Peggy I had always been on Saturday afternoons, and if anything, I may have been slightly warmer because I was aware of the performance and could control it. She used the bathroom while she was there. She was gone for perhaps 5 minutes. A little long, I thought, but I said nothing. After she left, I went upstairs. My bedroom door, which I habitually leave open, was pulled mostly closed. Not latched, but nearly so. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went in. My desk drawer was not quite closed. I keep it fully closed. I am a tidy person, by habit. Inside the drawer I keep, among other things, my current bank statements and the folder where I stored documents related to the house, the deed, the tax records, the insurance policy. I looked through them carefully. Everything was there. But the insurance policy was facing the wrong direction. I keep the labeled tab facing out, and it was now facing in. She'd been through my papers. I stood very still, holding the insurance folder, and I thought about what that meant. She wasn't just talking to Todd about her plans. She was actively investigating, looking for account numbers, property values, the name of my insurance carrier. Information you'd want if you were laying the groundwork for a legal move. A competency filing, perhaps, or simply building the case that she knew the full picture of my estate. Was this woman, my daughter, actually cataloging my assets without my knowledge in my own bedroom while I sat downstairs making her coffee? Apparently she was. I took out my phone and photographed the drawer as it was. Then I photographed the insurance folder. Then I put everything back exactly as Diane had left it, so she would have no reason to know I'd noticed. I sent the photographs to Patricia Oakes with a text message that said, "I believe my daughter searched my papers during a visit today. Is this relevant?" Patricia replied within the hour. "Document everything. Date, time, what was disturbed. This pattern of behavior will be relevant if she pursues any legal action. You are doing exactly the right thing." I made dinner that evening. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd heard the phone call that started all of this, and I ate my soup, and I looked out the window at the dark backyard where the maple tree was just a shape in the darkness. There was no more question of whether this was really happening. It was happening, and I had already taken the first steps to make sure it happened on my terms, not hers. I listed the house in the first week of November. Patricia had connected me with a real estate agent she trusted, a woman named Claudia Marsh, who worked out of an office in Dublin and had a reputation for discretion and fast closings. I met with Claudia twice before signing anything. I told her I wanted to sell quietly, without yard signs or open houses that would advertise the listing to the neighborhood and to my daughter. Claudia said that was more common than I might think, and that in the current market, for a property like mine, she expected multiple offers within 2 weeks. She was right. The listing went up on a Tuesday. By the following Friday, I had 4 offers, all within range of the asking price. One offer, from a family relocating from Columbus, came in at $990,000, cash, with a 45-day close. No contingencies. I took it. I signed the purchase agreement on a Thursday morning in Claudia's office. I felt, sitting there with the pen in my hand, the particular stillness of a person doing something irrevocable and knowing it. I signed anyway. Frank would have said I was being decisive. I signed. The day after the agreement was signed, I went back to Patricia's office and we rewrote my will entirely. Robert would receive the liquid assets from the house sale, held in a new account Diane had no knowledge of, plus my personal property. I established a small charitable bequest to St. Michael's. For Diane, I left a single line. To my daughter, Diane Briggs, I leave the sum of $1, reflecting my full awareness of her intentions and my deliberate choice. Patricia reviewed the language carefully to ensure it was unambiguous and would withstand a challenge. It would. I left her office that afternoon and drove to Dorothy's house and had tea, and I didn't tell Dorothy any of it, but I sat in her warm kitchen and listened to her talk about her grandchildren, and I felt almost like a normal person for an hour. Then on the second Saturday of November, Diane came to visit, and I knew the moment she walked in that something had changed. She was too composed. Todd was with her, which he wasn't always, and he had the quality of a man who has prepared what he wants to say. They sat at my kitchen table. My kitchen table, for what I now knew were only a few more weeks, and Diane put her hands flat on the surface and said, "Mom, we need to talk about the house." I looked at her. I said, "All right." She said she'd heard from a woman in her book club whose neighbor used Claudia Marsh that my house had been listed. She said she'd looked it up. She said she wanted to understand what was happening. I told her very calmly that I had sold the house, that the agreement was signed, that I was moving. The silence that followed was one of the longer silences of my adult life. Then Todd spoke. He said that he thought I might not understand the full implications of what I was doing, that selling a property of this value had tax consequences I should be aware of, that he was concerned, and here his voice took on a particular quality, careful and layered, that someone might have influenced me to make this decision, that perhaps I should speak to a doctor before proceeding. There it was. The word doctor placed very specifically, like a piece on a chessboard. I looked at Todd for a long moment. Then I said, "I have a real estate attorney, a tax advisor, and a physician who has documented my full cognitive health. The sale is legal, complete, and not subject to interference." Diane's face changed. The composed look fell away, and what was underneath it was not grief, and it was not concern, and it was not the face of a daughter who loved her mother. It was fury. She said, and her voice shook, "You had no right to do this without consulting me. This affects our family. This affects our future." "Your future," I said, "not mine." Todd said something about contesting the sale. I told him that Patricia Oakes of Oakes and Associates in Worthington had the file, and he was welcome to have his attorney contact her. I slid Patricia's card across the table. It had been sitting in my cardigan pocket for exactly this moment. They left 20 minutes later. Todd was still talking as they went down the porch steps, his voice low and controlled. Diane said nothing further. The door closed. I sat down. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the physical effort of having been completely still while everything in me wanted to shake. I breathed carefully until they stopped. Then I called Patricia and reported the conversation in detail. She said, "They won't contest the sale. There's no legal basis, but get ready for escalation." I knew she was right, and for that reason, I gave myself 4 days of deliberate rest. I went to Dorothy's for dinner. I attended Sunday Mass. I sat on the porch in the November cold and watched the maple tree losing its last leaves and tried to store the image, knowing I wouldn't have many more mornings here. I was tired, but I was not defeated. And those are not the same thing at all. The call came on a Wednesday evening, 10 days after the confrontation in my kitchen. Diane. Her voice was different this time. Softer. The anger smoothed over with something that was meant to sound like remorse. She said she'd been thinking. She said she and Todd had reacted badly, and she wanted to apologize for that. She said that what she really wanted, underneath everything, was to make sure I was taken care of. She said maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe she'd said some things that didn't come out right, and that she hoped we could sit down together and talk about what the future could look like for our family. I listened to all of this. I let her finish completely. Then I said, "What is it you're proposing, Diane?" She said, and the offer came out quickly, which told me it had been prepared, that if I called off the sale, she and Todd were prepared to move into the house with me. We could share it. She could help with the maintenance, be there if I needed anything. We could be a family again. I wouldn't be alone. Could she hear herself? Did she understand what she was offering and what it revealed? She was offering to move into my home, the home she had planned to sell, as though this were a gift to me rather than a continuation of the exact same strategy by a different route. I would be living in my own house as a guest, and Todd would be in the backyard again, hands in his pockets, waiting. I said, "That's very kind, Diane. I'll think about it." I would not be thinking about it. After we hung up, I sat for a moment with the phone in my lap, and I felt the very particular calm of a person who is no longer surprised by anything. The anger that had lived in my chest since October had burned down to something clean and cold, like an ember that's past the stage where it needs oxygen. It didn't need anything now. It simply was. The closing on the house was set for 3 weeks out. I had already arranged, quietly and on my own, to rent a condominium in a newer building near Worthington, close to Patricia's office, as it happened, which struck me as appropriate. 2 bedrooms, a balcony, a gym I would probably not use, and the profound luxury of living in a place that nobody in my family had ever expected me to want. I began packing, slowly and with intention, the way you pack when you are choosing what your life will contain going forward. Books I'd carried for 50 years. Frank's watch, which I kept in my nightstand. The photograph of Robert and Diane taken at the lake the summer she was 14 and he was 10, before she became whoever she had become, when I still believed I knew what she was. I kept that photograph. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because the girl in it wasn't lying yet. It was Dorothy who became my social ground during this time. I told her, finally, the full story. From the phone call to the sale to the conversation at the kitchen table to Diane's offer. This week. Dorothy listened with her hands wrapped around her mug, her expression moving through a range of reactions she was too polite to voice fully. At the end, she said, "Peggy, good God." "I know," I said. "And Robert?" This was the question I hadn't fully answered yet. I needed to tell Robert. It was becoming urgent. The closing was 3 weeks away, and he was still in Portland with no idea that his mother had sold the house he grew up in and cut his sister out of the will. He deserved to know, and I needed someone in my family to know, someone I could trust. I called him the next Sunday after church. I asked if he had some time to talk. He said of course. I told him everything from the beginning, the same way I'd told Patricia, the same way I'd told Dorothy, the careful linear order of a woman who knows that details matter. He was quiet for a very long time after I finished. Then he said, "Mom, why didn't you call me sooner?" "I needed to have the pieces in order first," I said. "I didn't want to alarm you without knowing what I was dealing with." Another pause. Then, "Is there anything you need me to do?" I said, "Not yet, but I may need you to come to Ohio before the end of the year." "I'll be there," he said, no hesitation. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for 3 more weeks. And I breathed, and the tightness that had been in my chest since October loosened just slightly. Not because the situation had changed, but because I was no longer holding it alone. Diane and Todd, I was told later by a mutual acquaintance, had consulted an attorney of their own. The attorney had apparently told them what Patricia had told me. The sale was solid, the documentation was clean, and there was no legal mechanism to stop it short of proving incompetence in a court proceeding, which, given my documented cognitive health, was not going to go anywhere good for them. They were watching, waiting to see if I would waver. I didn't waver. They came on a Friday afternoon, 9 days before the closing. I saw Todd's car in the driveway from the upstairs window, where I was sorting through the last of the linen closet. They hadn't called ahead. That told me something. People who want a genuine conversation call ahead. People who want to catch you off balance arrive without warning. I came downstairs, opened the door, and said, "Come in." Diane was carrying flowers. Dahlias from a grocery store, wrapped in cellophane. She held them out with an expression that I recognized from when she was 9 years old and had broken something and was trying to manage the fallout. Todd was dressed more carefully than he usually was for a casual visit. These were costumes. I took the flowers, thanked her, and put them in water. And we sat in the living room among my half-packed boxes. Diane looked at the boxes. I watched her look at them. I said nothing. She began the way she'd begun on the phone. Softly, with words about family and worry and her only wanting what was best. She said she'd been losing sleep. She said that if she had given the wrong impression, she was truly sorry. She said she missed her mother. I looked at her and I thought of that telephone call in October, the one where she'd forgotten to hang up. The clarity of her voice when she'd said she needs to go into a home. The particular business-like efficiency of a woman who had already made her decision and was simply discussing the logistics. You can paper over a lot of things with dahlias and a soft voice. You cannot paper over that. I said, "I appreciate you saying that, Diane." Todd leaned forward then. He said he wanted to talk practically, one adult to another. He said that phrase specifically, one adult to another, as if the question of whether I qualified had not already been raised implicitly by his earlier suggestion that I see a doctor. He said that the sale, while legally valid, had taken everyone by surprise. He said that the family, he used the word family, as though he were its appointed representative, deserved some input into a decision of this magnitude. I asked him what input he felt he should have had. He said carefully that a property like mine, sold quickly and without proper consultation, was unlikely to achieve full market value. He said he happened to know that the buyers I'd accepted were getting an exceptional deal. He said that if I were willing to terminate the agreement, He said terminate the agreement like a man who'd spent time with a lawyer. There was an investor he knew personally who would offer more. More money. A better outcome for everyone. More money. For everyone. Who was everyone? Todd, I said. The sale price was $990,000, cash, no contingencies. What figure is your investor proposing? He named a number. It was $30,000 higher. I said, and who would be handling the proceeds from that sale? A pause. Just a beat, but I'd been watching his face, and it was the pause of a man recalibrating. He said I would, of course, with the support of people who had my best interests at heart. The support of people who have my best interests at heart, I repeated. Diane's expression shifted then. A tightening around the eyes, the composure fraying. She said, Mom, we are trying to help you. We are trying to make sure you aren't taken advantage of. You are 74 years old and you sold your house in 3 weeks without telling your own family. Does that seem rational to you? Does that seem like something a person does when they are fully? She stopped, but the word was there, hanging in the room. Fully. Fully what, Diane? I let the silence stand for a moment. Then I said, I want to be very careful about where this conversation is going. She said she wasn't implying anything. She said she was worried. Her voice had gone somewhere between angry and something that might have been practiced emotion. I could not tell any more where the performance ended and the real person began, or whether there was still a real person I would recognize. I stood up. I said, I think we've said what needs to be said for today. My closing is in 9 days. My attorney is Patricia Oakes in Worthington, and her number is on the card I gave Todd last time. If there's anything further to discuss, that's the channel. They left. Todd with his jaw set. Diane with the particular rigid posture of a woman holding fury in with a great deal of effort. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway with my back to it, and then, for the first time since October, I felt genuine fear. Not the cold, analytical fear of those early nights. Something more immediate. They had as good as questioned my competence directly in my own living room. Fully. She hadn't said the word, but she'd aimed it, and we both knew where it was pointing. A court filing, a petition. A judge deciding whether Peggy Callahan could be trusted to manage her own affairs. I stood in the hallway for a long time, and then the fear did something unexpected. It gathered itself up and turned into something hard and certain in the center of my chest. I had 9 days. The closing would happen, and when it did, there would be nothing left to petition over. No house, no illusion that Diane had any particular claim on my future. Just money in an account, and a will that said what I meant, and a woman who had looked her daughter in the eye and not given an inch. I was afraid, yes, but I had never been more certain. I closed on the house on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Claudia was there, and Patricia and the buyers. The family from Columbus. The father with a handshake like Frank's, and 2 daughters who were going to grow up with that maple tree in the backyard. And I was glad about that. I was genuinely glad. And I signed my name to the documents with a steady hand, and walked out into the November morning holding a folder of paperwork and the largest check I had ever seen. Robert had arrived the night before. I'd picked him up from the airport myself, refused his offer to hire a car, and we'd sat up late in the kitchen of the condo I'd been renting for the past 11 days, and I'd told him the parts of the story I hadn't yet told by phone. He sat across from me with his coffee, very still, with Frank's way of listening that I've always loved in him. And when I finished, he said, I want to be there when you tell Diane. I said, I was hoping you'd say that. I had invited Diane and Todd to the condo the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Diane thought she was coming to discuss, in her mind presumably, There were still terms to negotiate, still some version of the future where she came out of this with what she'd intended. She arrived thinking she had leverage. That was important. We sat in the living room. Robert on the small sofa near the window, me in the armchair. Diane and Todd on the two chairs I'd arranged on the other side of the coffee table. It was late afternoon, gray outside, the bare branch light of late November. I set a copy of the signed closing documents on the coffee table. I set a copy of the revised will beside it. Diane looked at both and said nothing. I said, "The house sold. The closing was Tuesday. I wanted to have this conversation in person with Robert present." Todd said, "We know about the closing." His voice was controlled. "We're here because there are family decisions that still need to be made," Robert said. "What family decisions are those?" Todd glanced at him. Something shifted in his approach. He hadn't expected Robert to be here, and Robert's tone, which was pleasant and entirely without deference, seemed to recalibrate something in his strategy. He said, "The disposition of your mother's estate involves all of you." "Actually," I said, "it involves me, and I've made my decisions." Diane said, "Mom," I said, "let me finish." And something in my voice, the particular quality of a voice that has finished waiting, made her stop. I told them about the will. Not the full language, but the structure. Robert as primary beneficiary of the proceeds, the charitable bequest, and Diane's bequest. I said the last part clearly and without softening it. The silence after was of a completely different quality than any silence that had come before. Diane said, "That's not serious." I said, "Patricia Oakes drafted it. It has been witnessed and filed. It is entirely serious." She said, "You can't do this." Her voice had changed, gone thin, the way voices go when the mechanism of self-control has been strained past its capacity. "You're punishing me over a conversation." "A conversation," I said, "where you told your husband the house wasn't going to sell itself, and you weren't waiting another 5 years." "Yes." The color left her face. Todd stood up. He said, "This is actionable. A will drawn up under whatever this is." He waved his hand at the room in a gesture that seemed to mean your advanced age, your obvious instability, this whole situation. "We will challenge this," Robert said. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that she's being manipulated," Todd said. "By an attorney, by—" He stopped. "By whom?" Robert asked. He sounded genuinely curious. Todd had no answer to that, because the answer was nobody. I had sold my own house and changed my own will and retained my own attorney, and I had done all of it while Diane was bringing casseroles and searching my desk drawers, and there was not a manipulator anywhere in the picture except the two people sitting across the coffee table. Diane began to cry. Whether they were real tears or strategic ones, I couldn't tell anymore, and I realized I had stopped trying to tell the difference. She said that she'd only been trying to plan for the future, that she'd been frightened about what would happen to me, that I had never understood how much pressure she and Todd were under, the mortgage, the debt she'd never fully told me about, the years of financial stress. She was telling me their debts were the reason my house was supposed to be their solution. She was telling me this as though it were a mitigating factor. I looked at my daughter for a long time. I thought of the girl in the photograph, 14 years old at the lake, squinting into the sun. I thought of the woman who had brought the Sunrise Gardens brochure and left it on my table like a quiet declaration. And I said, with the calmness of someone who has been preparing to say a thing for a long time, "Diane, I love you, but I am not responsible for your debts. I am not a solution to a financial problem. I am your mother, and I was worth more than that, and I think somewhere underneath all of this you already know it." She had no answer for that either. Todd stood. Diane gathered herself, stood. They left without saying goodbye. Robert and I sat in the quiet living room. Outside, it was getting dark. After a while, he said, "Are you all right?" I thought about it. Then I said, "Yes, I actually am." As Patricia had predicted, Todd and Diane retained an attorney in December. I know this because Patricia received the initial correspondence just before Christmas. A letter from a firm in Columbus suggesting, in the formal language of people who are preparing a fight they don't entirely believe in, that the will had been executed under undue influence and that my competency at the time of signing should be evaluated. Patricia's reply, which I read before she sent it, was 3 pages long. It included the report from my physician, Dr. Hannah Wexler, who had been my doctor for 19 years and whose documentation of my cognitive health was thorough and contemporaneous. It included the timeline of my decisions, all of them independently made and verifiable. It included, as an attachment, the photographs I had taken of my desk drawer after Diane's visit in October, with the date and timestamp. The Columbus firm did not respond with a filing. They responded 2 weeks later with a 2-paragraph letter declining to proceed. I read that letter at my kitchen table in the condo. My kitchen table now, the one I'd bought second-hand at an estate sale on Worthington's main street, small and round and nothing like the old table on Clover Hill Road. I read it twice. Then I set it down and had my coffee. Diane called in January. I let it go to voicemail. She called again in February. I let that go to voicemail also. The messages were variations on a theme. She wanted to talk. She was hurt. She hoped I understood that she'd acted out of love. She wanted to repair the relationship. I listened to each message fully, which is more than I was obligated to do. I did not return the calls. This was not, I want to be clear, a decision made in anger. I had passed through anger some time ago. This was a decision made in the same clear-headed way I had made all the others, by considering what I actually wanted and needed in my life and acting accordingly. What I had no use for was an ongoing relationship governed by the permanent uncertainty of not knowing when the next audit would come, the next brochure on the table, the next carefully placed suggestion that I was not quite capable of managing my own affairs. I was capable. I had sold a house for $990,000, retained 2 attorneys and a financial advisor, changed my will, moved to a new home, and navigated a sustained campaign of manipulation by a person who had underestimated me. My competency was not in question. Robert came back for a long weekend in March. We went to the Botanical Garden, which was doing a winter orchid exhibition, and ate lunch at a restaurant where the waiter knew his name. He'd apparently been there the week before for a conference. We talked about the twins, and about Frank, and about what my next year might look like. I told him I was thinking about traveling. He said he thought that was an excellent idea. He didn't mention Diane, and neither did I. The legal situation settled finally, in spring. Patricia informed me that the will stood as written and that there were no further challenges pending. The estate, when the time came, and that time could be 20 years away because I intended to take good care of myself, would be distributed as I had directed. Robert, St. Michael's, and $1 to the woman who had taught me, late in life, the difference between a daughter and a person who was waiting for an inheritance. Patricia also told me something else, quietly, over the phone. She'd heard from a colleague that Todd and Diane were dealing with significant financial difficulty. The debt Diane had mentioned in the living room that November afternoon had apparently been more serious than a passing comment suggested. They were in the process of refinancing their house. The investment Todd had been waiting to deploy, presumably involving my property, had not materialized. I absorbed this information. I didn't feel satisfaction, or I didn't feel only satisfaction. I felt the complicated, uncomfortable feeling of watching a plan collapse on the people who made it, knowing that some of the collapse was of their own making and some of it was consequence, and those are not always easy to separate. But I did not intervene. I had not taken any action against them. I had only declined to be their solution. What came after that was theirs. The house on Clover Hill Road, I heard through Claudia, was settling into its new life. The Columbus family had painted the front door red. The maple tree was there, just as it had always been, and in spring it would go green again. Some things don't need you to be watching to keep going. Spring in Worthington turned out to be something I hadn't expected. Beautiful. I know that sounds like a small thing. But there's a difference between living somewhere because you've always lived there and choosing a place as an adult, with intention, because it suits the life you want. The condo complex had a courtyard with raised flower beds, and I'd claimed one of them from the building manager in April and planted sweet peas and dahlias. The irony of the dahlias was not lost on me. And by June, I had more flowers than I knew what to do with, and was bringing them to the nurses' station at the medical building down the street, who seemed genuinely pleased each time. I joined a book club, not the kind with wine and no books, the kind with both, as it turned out, which seemed to me the optimal arrangement. There were 7 women, ranging in age from 52 to 81, and the 81-year-old, whose name was Vera, and who had survived a genuinely eventful life, became my particular friend. She had a way of responding to stories of human disappointment by saying, "Well, of course," which I found deeply comforting. When I told her my story, she said exactly that, and poured more wine, and that was somehow exactly right. I booked a trip to Portugal for September. Frank had always meant for us to go, and then the years had arranged themselves otherwise, and then he was gone. I booked it myself, through an actual travel agent, stayed 11 days in Lisbon, took a train to Porto, and walked more than I would have believed my knee would allow. I came home with a linen jacket and 2 bottles of wine, and a sense of myself as a person who was still, at 74, capable of doing things for the first time. Dorothy came to visit in October. We walked along the Olentangy Trail and had lunch, and she mentioned that the house on Clover Hill Road had new rose bushes along the front fence, which I thought Frank would have liked. Robert called every Sunday. The twins were playing baseball. He said carefully once that Diane had reached out to him, and I said I understood, and I didn't ask him to choose sides because I never had. As for Diane and Todd, their financial situation had become more difficult than even the December rumor had suggested. They'd been unable to sustain the mortgage on their development house and had, by summer, moved into a rental. Todd's position at his firm had changed after a restructuring. I didn't know the specifics, and I didn't seek them out. I heard, through a woman at church, that Diane spoke of me rarely, and when she did, it was with a brittleness that made people change the subject. Whether things would improve for her, I genuinely didn't know. I thought about her sometimes. I thought about the photograph I'd kept, the one of her and Robert at the lake, the summer she was 14. I still had it, in a frame on the bookshelf. I had not moved it. What I had come to understand, slowly and without bitterness, was that Diane had been afraid too, not in ways that excused what she'd done. Fear doesn't excuse planning to dispossess your mother while bringing her lasagna. But fear was there underneath. Fear about money. Fear about the future. She had underestimated me, and I think she had underestimated herself. Somewhere in her calculus had been the assumption that taking from me was easier than building something for herself, and that assumption had proved catastrophically wrong. My life, meanwhile, kept exceeding its own expectations. I took a watercolor class at the community center, which I turned out to be mediocre at and enjoyed enormously. I became a regular at a breakfast spot near the condo, where the cook knew to bring my coffee before I ordered. I had dinner with Patricia twice. First professionally, then because we found the same things funny. I did not miss being managed. I did not miss the uncertainty of Diane's visits. I missed Frank. I always miss Frank. But that's a different kind of missing. The clean, permanent kind that lives alongside everything else without taking anything away. On a Sunday in November, almost exactly a year after the closing, I sat on my balcony in a sweater and watched the street below. Families walking dogs, a child on a bicycle, the sky that particular shade of late autumn blue that only happens for a few weeks and then is gone. I had $1 in my will and 990,000 reasons for it, and I was sitting on a balcony I'd chosen for myself, in a life I'd built from the wreckage of a betrayal. I was happy, genuinely, quietly, irreversibly happy. That's not a small thing either. If there's anything this year taught me, it's this. Being old doesn't mean being finished. It means you've had long enough to know the difference between people who love you and people who are waiting. I was lucky. I heard the call. Not everyone does. To anyone listening who has felt that chill, that first moment of wondering whether the people around you see you or see what you leave behind, trust that feeling. Then act. Get a real attorney. Document everything. Call the child who actually shows up, and never, never mistake someone's plans for your future with care about your present. Would you have done what I did? Would you have had the nerve to sell the house, change the will, and sit across from your own daughter without flinching? I'd genuinely like to know. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment or share it with someone who might need to hear it. And thank you, truly, for listening to an old woman who refused to be managed. My husband secretly transferred our home into his name and sold it for $1.5 million. The new owners were already standing at the door with the keys. I smiled, let them in, and immediately called my lawyer. What happened next? Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. The house on Clover Hill Road had been mine long before it was ours. I want you to understand that from the very beginning, because it matters. It matters more than I realized for most of my marriage. My father built that house in 1961. Poured the foundation with his own hands on a Saturday in October. And I grew up watching the oak tree in the backyard grow from a sapling into something you could lean against and feel the whole weight of the world ease off your shoulders. When my parents passed, they left the house to me, not to us. To me, Margaret Ann Arlo, née Whitfield. I was 51 years old, and I thought that detail, my name on the deed, was just a formality, the kind of paperwork nobody thinks about until they have to. Dennis and I had been married for 31 years by then. We weren't a romantic story, not the kind you'd tell at a dinner party. We were practical, steady. He sold commercial insurance, I had retired from teaching 4th grade, and we spent our evenings watching the news and arguing pleasantly about whether the tomatoes needed more water. I cooked Sunday roasts. He fixed the gutters in the fall. We were, as far as I understood the word, fine. The first sign came in March, about 14 months before everything fell apart. Dennis started taking phone calls in the garage. Now, I am not a paranoid woman. I have never gone through a man's pockets or checked his phone. That has never been my nature. But Dennis had always been a loud talker. You could hear him from 2 rooms away, the kind of voice that filled a space whether you wanted it to or not. and suddenly, he was taking his coffee out to the garage and closing the door. And when he came back in, his expression had that careful blankness that I recognized from 30 years of marriage as the face he wore when he didn't want me to ask questions. I didn't ask, not then. In April, he suggested we take a trip to Florida. Dennis hated Florida. He had always called it God's waiting room, with the particular contempt of a man who refused to acknowledge that he was 66 years old. But there he was, cheerful in a way that felt rehearsed, spreading a travel brochure across the kitchen table and suggesting Clearwater Beach. I went along with it. We spent a week in a rental condo and he was distant and pleasant, like a man performing the role of husband for an audience I couldn't see. When we came home, I noticed a file folder on his desk that he moved quickly when I walked into the study. That was when the cold feeling started. Not panic, not accusation, just a low, steady chill. The way a house feels when a window has been left open somewhere, and you can't find which one. By June, I had started paying closer attention. I noticed he'd asked me, twice, in casual conversation, whether I still had the original deed documents from when my parents' estate was settled. I told him I kept everything in the fireproof box in the bedroom closet. He nodded and didn't bring it up again. I didn't think much of it at the time. Later, I would understand exactly why he was asking. I also noticed he had started spending time with a woman from his office, Kristen Daly. I had met her once at a company Christmas party. Mid-40s, careful smile, the kind of woman who always seems to be evaluating the room. He mentioned her name a few times in passing, said she was handling a big account with him. I filed that information in the back of my mind the way you file things you're not ready to look at directly. The summer passed. The oak tree in the backyard turned gold. I made apple butter and called my daughter Claire in Portland every Sunday and told her everything was fine because I believed it mostly was. And because what would I even say? And then came that Tuesday in September. I had been at my book club, Doris Hartley's house on Maple Street. We were reading Olive Kitteridge for the second time and arguing about whether Olive was sympathetic. And I came home at 3:30 to find an unfamiliar silver SUV parked in my driveway. A couple stood on my porch, late 30s, well-dressed, the woman holding a set of keys on a plain metal ring. The man had a folder tucked under his arm. They looked at me with an expression I did not immediately understand, a mixture of recognition and discomfort. "Mrs. Harlow?" the woman said. "We were told the house would be vacant." I looked at the keys in her hand. I looked at the folder under his arm. And somewhere in the center of my chest, something that had been quietly tightening for months finally pulled completely taut. I smiled. I cannot fully explain why I smiled. Instinct, perhaps, or the 40 years of practice that comes from managing a classroom full of 9-year-olds who are all lying to you simultaneously. I smiled and I said, "Oh, of course, please come in." And I stepped aside and held the door open. And the moment they walked past me into my living room, I reached into my purse and called Franklin Greer. Franklin was my attorney. He had handled my parents' estate. He had known me for 22 years. He picked up on the second ring. "Franklin," I said quietly, stepping into the kitchen while the couple stood uncertainly in my hallway. "I need you to tell me right now whether anyone has legally transferred the deed to my house." There was a silence on the line that told me everything before he said a single word. Franklin's pause lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. "Margaret," he said, and he never called me Margaret unless something was serious. "I need you to stay calm and not say anything definitive to whoever is in that house with you right now." So it was true. I had known it the moment I saw those keys, but knowing something and having an attorney confirm it are two entirely different experiences. Knowing is a feeling. Confirmation is the floor dropping out from under you. I understand, I said, in the same even voice I had once used to tell a classroom of children that yes, there was a fire drill, and no, they did not need to panic. I walked back into the hallway. The couple, they told me later their names were Ryan and Melissa Cook, and I want to be clear that they were not villains in this story. They were buyers who had been deceived just as I had. Were standing near the staircase, visibly uncomfortable. The woman still had those keys in her hand, a house key, my house key, cut from a copy that someone had made without my knowledge. "I'm so sorry," I said pleasantly. "There seems to have been a miscommunication about the timeline. Could I ask you to give me 24 hours? I just need to confirm a few details with my husband." I kept the smile absolutely steady. "I'm sure we can get this sorted out." They exchanged a glance. The husband, Ryan, started to say something about a closing date and a moving truck already booked, and I listened to all of it with great attention and nodded in exactly the right places. And then I walked them back to the door and watched their silver SUV back out of my driveway. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and I let myself have 10 minutes. I want to be honest with you about those 10 minutes, because I think people sometimes expect the wronged party in a story like this to be immediately fierce, immediately strategic. I was not. I sat in the kitchen of the house my father had built, at the table where I had fed my children breakfast for 20 years, and I was afraid. Genuinely, physically afraid. The kind of fear that sits in your stomach and makes you feel like you're 80 years old and very small. 31 years of marriage, 31 years of someone's name next to yours on Christmas cards and joint tax returns and the shared shorthand of a life built together. And it had been used against me like a tool. I let myself have those 10 minutes. Then I stood up and washed my face at the kitchen sink. Here is what I knew, sitting at that table before I made another call. Dennis had somehow transferred the deed to my house, inherited from my parents, with my name on the original title, into his name alone, and had then sold it to the Cook family for a sum I would later learn was $1.5 million. He had arranged a closing. He had handed over keys. He had done all of this while I attended book club and made apple butter and called our daughter every Sunday. The questions came fast and cold. Had he forged my signature? Had he found a way through the estate documents? Where was the money? Was it already gone? Was Kristen Daly involved? And underneath all of those questions, the one I kept flinching from, how long had he been planning this? I called Franklin back. The next 40 minutes were the most clarifying of my adult life. Franklin spoke carefully and precisely, the way he always does, and what he told me was this. A deed transfer had been recorded at the county recorder's office 11 weeks earlier. The signature on the transfer document carried my name. I had not signed any such document, which meant one of two things. Either the signature was forged, or I had been manipulated into signing something I didn't understand, possibly buried in a stack of other paperwork. Franklin said the second scenario was more common than most people believed. "What are my options?" I asked. "Your options are significant," he said, "but you need to act carefully and you need to act soon." We agreed to meet the following morning at 9. Before we hung up, Franklin told me one more thing. Under Oregon law, we were in Clover Hill, a suburb of Portland. A marital home required both spouses' consent for sale, regardless of how title was held, if it qualified as the primary residence. There were grounds, potentially strong grounds, to challenge the transfer as fraudulent and to seek an injunction against the sale proceeding. "He may not know that you know yet," Franklin said. "He doesn't," I said. Then don't tell him tonight. Dennis came home at 6:15, the same time he had come home for 30 years. He smelled like the same aftershave. He asked what was for dinner. He hung his keys on the hook by the door. Not my house keys, I noticed, his car keys. And I made spaghetti. And we sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where I had spent 10 minutes being afraid, and I listened to him talk about a golf game he was planning with someone from the office, and I said, and that sounds nice, and I did not say a single true thing for the entire meal. Watching him that night, the ease of him, the comfort, I felt the fear convert into something else, something quieter and colder and considerably more useful. I had been a teacher for 37 years. I knew how to be patient. I knew how to watch a situation develop and choose exactly the right moment to act. And I knew, with a clarity that surprised me with its force, that I was not going to let Dennis Harlow take my father's house. Before I went to sleep that night, I wrote 3 things in the small notebook I kept in my nightstand: the money, the signature, the woman. Those were the 3 threads I needed to pull. I also wrote a 4th line, which I underlined twice. Do not let him know you know. That was my plan in its earliest form. Crude, yes. But sometimes the most important strategic decision you make is simply to keep your face completely still. I was in Franklin's office at 8:55 the next morning. His office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, the kind of place with dark wood paneling and the particular smell of old case files. And I had been there enough times over the years that his receptionist, a young woman named Becca, just waved me through without buzzing. I sat across from Franklin's desk in the same chair I'd sat in when we'd settled my mother's estate, and I put the fireproof box on the desk between us. I had retrieved it from the bedroom closet at 5:30 that morning while Dennis slept. I had been very quiet. Inside the box were the original property deed from 1961 in my father's name, the probate documents from when the house transferred to me after my parents passed, my own name on every line, and every property tax notice we had received for the subsequent 17 years, all addressed to Margaret A. Harlow. I also brought every piece of paper I could find that bore my signature: bank documents, insurance forms, a letter to our homeowners association from 2 years ago. Franklin spread them across his desk and studied them for a long time without speaking. I'm going to refer you to someone, he said, a forensic document examiner. Her name is Dr. Patricia Voss. She works out of a firm in Beaverton, and she has testified as an expert witness in 17 fraud cases in this state. I want her to look at the signature on the transfer deed. How quickly can she do it? For something like this, I'll call her this morning. Probably 3 to 4 days for a preliminary assessment. 3 to 4 days. I thought about the Cook family and their moving truck. What about the sale? I asked. If they have a closing date, I filed for a temporary restraining order this morning at 7 a.m., Franklin said. The transfer of title is frozen pending investigation. The Cook family's attorney has already been notified. I sat very still for a moment. You filed before I even arrived. I filed the moment you called me yesterday, he said. He said it simply, without drama, and I was grateful for that. Margaret, what he did, if the signature is forged, and I believe it is not just a civil matter. This is deed fraud. It's a felony in this state. I had known that was coming. I had known it intellectually since the night before. But hearing it said plainly in a wood-paneled office at 9 in the morning with my father's 1961 deed lying on the desk between us made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I drove home along the river. The water was gray-green and very still. I kept both hands on the wheel. Dennis was still home when I got back. He usually left for the office by 9, but his car was still in the driveway, which was unusual enough to make my pulse quicken slightly. I found him in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, and there was something off about his posture, a kind of alertness that wasn't his normal morning looseness. "Where were you?" he asked. Casual, but his eyes weren't casual. "Grocery run," I said, and held up the small bag I'd had the presence of mind to stop for on the way home. Milk, bread, a box of chamomile tea. We were out of milk. He looked at the bag. He looked at me. I have no idea whether he noticed the fireproof box was gone from the closet. He would have had to look specifically for it to know, and I had replaced it with a similarly sized box of old tax returns. But something was operating behind his eyes that morning that told me the comfortable weeks of his unawareness were ending. I made breakfast. I did not shake. 4 days later, Dr. Patricia Voss sent her preliminary report to Franklin. I read it sitting in Franklin's office again, this time with a cup of tea that had gone cold in my hands. The report was 19 pages. The summary was 3 paragraphs. The most important sentence was in the second paragraph, and I read it twice. The question signature on document A, warranty deed transfer, recorded date, exhibits significant variation from the known exemplars in letter formation, pen pressure, and baseline alignment, inconsistent with normal variation, and is consistent with simulation by a person other than the purported signer. Forged. My signature had been forged on a legal document to steal my house. I put the paper down on Franklin's desk and looked out his window at the traffic below and thought about the woman named Kristen Daly and whether she had known and how long it had been planned and at what specific point in our 31-year marriage my husband had looked at me and decided I was an obstacle rather than a person. "There's something else," Franklin said. He turned his computer screen toward me. He had pulled the county property records, following the money the way you follow a river to its source. The sale price was listed, $1,500,000. The wire transfer had gone to a joint account, not our joint account, a new one, opened 6 months ago at a bank I'd never heard of, in the names of Dennis R. Harlow and Kristen Ann Daly. There it was, all 3 threads in one document. I thought about the 10 minutes I had spent being afraid at my kitchen table. I thought about my father driving fence posts into the earth on a cold October morning in 1961. I thought about every Sunday I had spent making the roast and not asking questions. "What do we do next?" I asked. Franklin had already printed the filing forms. This was the point, I realized. Sitting in that chair with forged paper and a fraudulent bank account on the desk in front of me, from which there was no returning to anything that had been before. Not to the spaghetti dinners. Not to the comfortable silences. Not to the version of my life in which I had been the woman who did not ask questions. I picked up a pen and I started signing my actual, real, unforged name. The restraining order hit Dennis like a cold bucket of water, and I know this because I was home when he got the call. It was a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after my second meeting with Franklin. I was in the garden. I had been spending more time in the garden that week, finding that physical work was the only reliable way to keep my hands from trembling. When I heard Dennis's voice through the kitchen window rise in a way it almost never did, a sudden, sharp elevation, the voice of a man who has just stepped on something unexpected in the dark. I stayed in the garden. I deadheaded the roses very slowly and listened. By the time he came outside, he had composed himself into something that was almost his normal face. Almost. There was a tightness around his jaw that I recognized from 31 years as the specific look of a man who is recalculating. Margaret. He almost never called me Margaret. "Dennis," I said and clipped a stem. "I need to talk to you about the house." "Which house?" I asked pleasantly. The recalculation behind his eyes went into overdrive. He had expected, I think, either tears or ignorance. He had not expected pleasantness. He had not considered, in whatever plan he had assembled with Kristen Daly, that the woman who had spent 37 years managing the emotional temperature of classrooms full of 9-year-olds might be somewhat more difficult to destabilize than he'd assumed. "Franklin Greer filed something," he said. "Did he?" I put down my clippers and looked at him directly, perhaps for the first time in months. "That must have been surprising for you." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he went back inside. That evening, Kristen Daly called my cell phone. I did not know she had my number. I found out later Dennis had given it to her, apparently because they had expected to need to negotiate. And hearing her voice, composed and almost sympathetic, was one of the more surreal experiences of that period. She said she wanted to explain. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said that Dennis had told her the house was solely in his name, and she had no reason to believe otherwise. I let her finish. "Kristen," I said, "my attorney will be in touch with yours. Margaret, if this goes to court—" "Then it goes to court," I said, and ended the call. 2 days later, they came to the house together. I want to be precise about this moment because it revealed something important about both of them. They came together, which told me that individually they were afraid of what I might say or do, and that they needed the psychological reinforcement of each other. Dennis rang the bell as though he didn't have a key, which by that point he didn't, because I had changed the locks the morning after my second meeting with Franklin, a detail that clearly startled him when I opened the door and he instinctively reached for his pocket. Kristen was polished, she was calm, and she stood at a slight angle to Dennis in a way that positioned her as the rational party, in contrast to the potential chaos she expected from me. She was perhaps 44 or 45. She had the careful poise of a woman who has learned to manage difficult conversations professionally, and for a moment I understood why Dennis had found her compelling. She projected capability. "We'd like to come in," Dennis said. I considered this for exactly 2 seconds. Then I stepped aside. They sat at my kitchen table. I noticed Dennis's eyes move to the fireproof box's usual spot on the shelf, which was now empty. And Kristen spoke first. She had clearly prepared. The core of what she said was this: that pursuing legal action would be costly, prolonged, and damaging to everyone, including my daughter Claire, whose name she mentioned in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. She said that a private settlement could be arranged quickly. She implied, without stating directly, that my willingness to litigate would be portrayed as a vindictive older woman attempting to sabotage her husband's retirement finances. I looked at her while she talked. I looked at Dennis, who was not meeting my eyes. "Let me make sure I understand," I said when she finished. "You're suggesting that I accept a private payment, relinquish any legal claim to my father's house, and in exchange, you'll refrain from telling people I'm being vindictive." "I wouldn't put it that way." "I would," I said, "and my answer is no." Dennis finally looked at me. "Peggy, if this goes criminal, deed fraud is a felony, Dennis. It was a felony when you committed it." The temperature in the kitchen changed. Kristen's composure slipped for just a moment, a tightening around the eyes that she covered quickly, and Dennis went very still in the way that men go still when they realize they have significantly miscalculated the nature of the person they've been living with. They left 20 minutes later. No settlement, no agreement. Nothing resolved except the question of whether I could be pressured, which had been answered definitively. I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a moment. My heart was beating faster than I would have liked. I was 68 years old, and I had just told my husband of 31 years and his mistress in my own kitchen that I intended to bring a felony case against them, and the reality of what that meant. The months ahead, the courtroom, the public nature of it all, settled on me like a weight. I called my daughter Claire that evening, not the Sunday call, a real call. She arrived from Portland the following Friday. I took those 4 days for myself. I sat in the garden in the mornings. I read. I did not answer emails about the case. I let Franklin handle the correspondence, and I let myself be still for a short stretch before the real work began, because I had learned in 37 years of teaching that the people who last longest in a fight are not the ones who burn brightest at the start, but the ones who know when to rest. Claire arrived on a Friday evening with a bag large enough for 2 weeks and an expression I had last seen on her face when she was 9 years old, and had decided to personally hold accountable a boy in her class who had stolen her library book. My daughter is 43, a structural engineer, and she has my father's jaw and my mother's determination and very little patience for dishonesty in any of its forms. She sat at the kitchen table while I made tea, and I told her everything from the beginning. I told her about the garage phone calls, about Florida, about the file folder he'd moved, about the Cook family on the porch with keys cut from locks I hadn't changed, about Kristen Daly's phone call and the joint bank account bearing both their names and the $1.5 million that had passed through it. I told her about the forged signature, reading her the relevant line from Dr. Voss's report from memory, the words simulation by a person other than the purported signer falling into the kitchen with the particular weight of professional confirmation. Claire held her tea and did not speak until I had finished. Then she said, "Mom, where is he now?" "He checked into the Residence Inn on Burnside 3 days ago," I said. "I changed the locks." She nodded slowly. "Good. Then, what do you need from me?" That question. I had been holding myself together for 2 weeks, largely on forward motion, and the avoidance of stopping long enough to ask that question of myself. What did I need? I needed someone to sit across from me at this table who was not performing, who was not calculating, who was simply there. I had forgotten, in the strange sealed world of the previous 2 weeks, what it felt like to have someone simply be on your side without conditions. "I need you to stay for a while," I said. "Obviously," Claire said and refilled my tea. The following week was, in its way, the quietest of that entire period. Dennis and Kristen had retreated, not out of surrender, I understood, but out of strategy. They were consulting with their own attorney, a man named Howard Bloom, whose name Franklin mentioned with a very slight pause that conveyed a library of professional opinion. They were preparing their own narrative. I knew this. Franklin knew this, but the immediate noise had stopped, and in the quiet, I could hear myself think again. I want to tell you about something that happened on the Wednesday of that week, because it mattered more than it might sound. My friend Doris Hartley, from the book club, the one whose house I'd been at the evening this all began, came by with a casserole. Doris is 71 and has lived 3 doors down from me for 22 years, and she is the kind of woman who processes information slowly and then acts on it with great solidity. She sat in my living room while Claire was out, and she said, "Peggy, I need you to know that everyone on this street knows what he did, and not one person is neutral." I hadn't expected that. I hadn't told anyone except Claire, Franklin, and my sister in Ohio. But Clover Hill was a neighborhood in the old sense. People noticed when a strange car was in a driveway, when a woman walked her garden with a tighter jaw than usual, when a man suddenly stopped being seen carrying in groceries on Saturday mornings. People talked. And in this case, they had talked in my favor. "They'll say things," Doris said. "In court or wherever, people who've seen him come and go. Neighbors who had appraisers walking through without anyone explaining why." I kept a note last spring when a man with a clipboard was photographing your house from the sidewalk. I didn't know what it meant then. A man with a clipboard photographing my house. That photograph would later appear in Dennis's records as part of the property appraisal documentation. Doris's note of the date placed it 6 weeks before the fraudulent deed transfer. I wrote down the date she gave me and called Franklin the next morning. Meanwhile, Dennis and Kristen apparently decided that patience was their best weapon. According to what Franklin heard through proper legal channels, their defense was taking shape around 2 arguments. First, that I had been aware of and had verbally consented to the sale as part of an informal marital agreement. And second, that the signature on the deed was not forged, but was the result of my signing a document I had been confused about. That second argument, confused elderly woman didn't understand what she was signing, was the one that made Claire's jaw go hard when I told her. "They're going to try to make you seem incompetent," she said. "I know," I said. "How do you want to handle it?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about 37 years of maintaining a classroom. I thought about the 10 minutes of fear I had given myself at the kitchen table and then never returned to. I thought about Dr. Voss's 19-page report and the date Doris had written in her notebook. Calmly, I said, "There is a kind of power that becomes available to you when you stop being afraid of someone's narrative about you." Dennis had constructed a version of me, confused, passive, aging, easily managed, that had apparently been convincing enough for him to bet a $1.5 million fraud on. That version of me had made him comfortable. It had made him careless. And carelessness, in matters of law, leaves traces. The traces were accumulating. I spent those quiet days organizing them. Franklin and I spoke every other day. I submitted a formal affidavit attesting that I had never verbally or otherwise consented to any sale of the property and had no knowledge of any such proceeding until September. Dr. Voss finalized her report, 23 pages in its final form, and was confirmed as the expert witness for the hearing. Claire, who turned out to have a highly specific competence in reading structural and property documents from her engineering work, reviewed everything in the case file and found 2 additional inconsistencies in the closing paperwork that Franklin's team then followed up on. Through all of it, Dennis and Kristen watched. I could feel it. The occasional unknown number calling and hanging up when I answered. The white sedan that parked on our street for 2 hours one afternoon. Watching to see if I would wobble. Watching to see if the casseroles and the quiet days and the accumulated weight of 31 years would eventually soften my position. I did not wobble. I planted tulip bulbs on Saturday and thought about spring. They came on a Sunday, which was, I thought, deliberately chosen. Sunday was the day I called Claire, before she moved in, the day of roast dinners and deliberate normalcy. I think Dennis believed that the day itself carried some residual power over me, some Pavlovian pull toward civility and the maintenance of the household peace. He rang the bell at 2 in the afternoon. He was alone this time. No Kristen. I let him in because refusing would have been, legally speaking, complicated. We were still technically married, the divorce filing having been initiated but not yet finalized. And because I was, honestly, curious about what approach he had decided on. The visits that are most revealing are the ones where someone believes they are being clever. He sat in the living room, not the kitchen, which was a deliberate choice. The living room was more formal, less intimate. The room we had used for guests. He had dressed carefully. The blue sweater I had given him 2 Christmases ago, which I recognized as a calculated choice. He looked tired and, I will give him this, somewhat diminished from the man who had stood in my garden 2 weeks earlier with a recalculating expression. Howard Bloom had apparently been honest with him about the strength of the case against them. He started with the past, This is a technique I had seen in parents at teacher conferences more times than I could count. When the direct argument is failing, you go to the emotional history. You invoke the shared investment. You remind the other party of what they stand to lose by continuing to fight. Dennis talked about our first house together, a rental in Gresham back in 1989. He talked about Claire's childhood. He talked about his own father's failing health, which was real, and which I did have sympathy for. He talked about how the stress of the case was affecting him. I listened. I kept my hands in my lap. I did not say anything that could be construed as softening. And then, when the sentimentality had failed to produce the response he needed, the second layer emerged. Peggy. He leaned forward. Howard has found something. In your mother's estate filing. There's an argument to be made that the transfer of the property to you personally, rather than to both of us jointly, was contestable, based on intent. I looked at him. Your parents' will didn't specify you alone. Howard believes that with the marriage already established at the time of the estate. My parents left the house to me, I said, by name, in a will that was probated in Washington County in 2007 with Franklin Greer as the estate attorney. The document is not ambiguous. Dennis shifted. Howard thinks, I would be careful, I said, about what Howard thinks he can do with my parents' estate. The sentimentality was gone now. In its place was something I had not seen very often in 31 years of marriage, a direct display of what I can only call contempt. Not the contempt of someone who hates you, but the particular contempt of someone who has decided you are an obstacle they intend to dismantle. You're 68 years old, Peggy, he said. This case will take 2 years. The legal fees alone, Franklin charges $400 an hour. Do you understand what this will cost you? Do you understand what forging my signature will cost you? I said. Silence. This isn't a game, he said, and his voice had dropped in a way I had not heard before, a lowering of register that was intended, I think, to signal a kind of seriousness that hadn't been present in earlier conversations. Howard is prepared to argue that you have shown signs of cognitive decline, that your testimony is supported, I said, by a forensic document examiner with 17 expert witness cases, a signed affidavit, property records dating back to 1961, and a neighbor's dated written record of unauthorized appraisal activity on my property. What is Howard's testimony supported by? Dennis stood up. At this point, Kristen's voice came from the front hallway. She had been in the car, I realized. She had been waiting in the car during the soft first act, and now she walked in without knocking. I had not fully closed the front door, a mistake I noted and did not repeat. And she stood in my living room with the composure of someone who has made a decision and is past caring how it lands. Mrs. Harlow, she said, I want to be direct with you. We have enough to tie this up in litigation for 3 years. The Cooks are considering their own civil suit against you for the delayed transfer. Your attorney's fees will exceed anything you receive in a settlement. The smart thing, the practical thing, is to take what we're offering, which is fair, and move on. What you're offering, I said, is the proceeds of a fraudulent sale reduced by your legal fees in exchange for my silence about a felony. I looked at her with great steadiness. That's not a settlement. That's hush money. The mask, the professional composure, the careful positioning, came off in a way that was almost a relief to witness. Her voice went tight. You're making a mistake. I've made mistakes, I said. Trusting your partner for 31 years was one of them. I don't intend to make another. Dennis said her name. She ignored him. You're going to spend everything you have fighting this, she said. And you're going to lose. And you're going to be alone in this house. If I still have this house, I said, I'll be quite content. They left. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. my deadbolt, on my lock, and leaned against it for just a moment. My hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. Not from fear, precisely, though fear was present. It was more the physical release of adrenaline after an hour of very controlled stillness, my body catching up to what my mind had been doing. I made a cup of tea. I sat down. I allowed the trembling to pass. And then I noticed something interesting. The fear, rather than expanding in the quiet, was transforming. It was converting, as it had once before at this table, into something colder and harder and considerably more durable. Every threat they had made, the cognitive decline argument, the litigation costs, the Cook civil suit, had been, from a legal standpoint, noise. Howard Blum was a good attorney, but he was working with a forged document, a fraudulent account, and a client whose guilt was documented in 19, now 23, pages of forensic analysis. They were threatening me because they were afraid. That realization settled into my chest like ballast. I called Franklin on Monday morning and told him exactly what had been said, including the cognitive decline strategy. "Good," Franklin said with the same dry directness he always had. "That will not help them in front of the judge." The hearing was set for 6 weeks from Thursday. I went back to the garden. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. What we had was a civil courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse. Plain fluorescent light, wood-paneled walls gone pale with age, and approximately 14 people present, including the attorneys, the clerk, the judge, and the Cook family, who sat on the opposite side of the gallery with their own attorney and the expression of people who have spent 6 months in a nightmare they didn't ask for. I wore my gray dress with the pearl buttons. Claire sat in the gallery 2 rows behind me. Doris Hartley had offered to come, and I had told her to stay home. But when I walked in, I saw her in the back row in her good coat, which made me grip my folder more tightly for a moment to keep my composure. Dennis and Kristen sat at the respondents' table with Howard Blum between them. Howard was a trim man in his late 50s, with a very controlled face. The face of someone who has learned to project confidence, regardless of what the underlying circumstances warrant. Kristen was in navy blue. Dennis was in the gray suit he'd worn to both of our children's college graduations. Franklin presented first. The forensic document analysis, the county recorder's timeline, the bank account opened in Kristen's and Dennis's names 6 months before the transfer, into which the sale proceeds had been directly deposited. A property appraiser who confirmed that Dennis had contacted him in March of the previous year, 7 months before the fraudulent deed transfer, requesting a private appraisal and specifically instructing him not to contact the homeowner. That last one landed. I saw Howard Blum write something quickly on his notepad. Then Doris testified. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap, and the particular dignity of a 71-year-old woman who has decided to tell the truth and is not interested in anyone's opinion about it. She gave the date, the time, and a description of the man with the clipboard, a description that matched the appraiser who had just testified. She produced her written note, dated in her own hand, admitted as Exhibit 12. Howard's cross-examination of Doris was brief. There wasn't much to work with. Then it was my turn. Franklin walked me through everything. The inheritance, the original deed, the fireproof box, my certainty that I had never signed any transfer document, never been consulted about any sale, never given consent of any kind. He asked me to look at the signature on the deed transfer and tell the court whether it was mine. "It is not," I said. "How certain are you?" "Completely certain. I have signed my name the same way for 50 years. That is not my signature." Howard Blum's cross-examination circled the cognitive decline argument without fully committing to it, implying confusion, questioning my certainty, suggesting that stress had perhaps affected my memory. He was good at it. But here is the thing about 37 years in a classroom. You know exactly when someone is performing certainty versus when they actually have it. Howard was performing. He had no positive facts to establish, only doubt to introduce. I answered every question directly, calmly, and completely. When he asked whether I might have signed something I didn't fully read, I said, "I am a former teacher, Mr. Blum. I have read every document I have signed for 40 years. That is not a habit I developed recently." Someone in the gallery made a small sound. The judge did not look up. Howard called Dennis. Under Franklin's cross-examination, Dennis was asked to provide the date of his claimed verbal conversation with me about the sale. He gave a month, April. Franklin produced our joint bank records from April, showing nothing consistent with a real estate discussion, and the plane tickets and hotel receipts from our Florida trip that same month, during which Dennis had previously stated in a deposition we had discussed the future of the property over dinner. "What restaurant?" Franklin asked. Dennis looked at Howard. Howard did not look back. "I don't remember the name," Dennis said. "What did you order?" I don't remember." "Mr. Harlow, can you describe anything specific about this dinner at which you claim your wife verbally consented to the sale of her inherited property?" The silence lasted long enough to be recorded. Kristen held up better than Dennis under questioning. She was more capable under pressure. But her account contained 3 specific inconsistencies with Dennis's that Howard had apparently failed to reconcile during preparation. Franklin identified all 3 and laid them on the record one after another with systematic precision. By the time Judge Carla Reyes called the afternoon recess, Dennis was leaning close to Howard in urgent, quiet conversation, and Kristen was staring at the table with the fixed expression of someone who has processed, but not yet fully accepted, that a situation has gone irreversibly wrong. Claire found me in the hallway near the window. "You okay?" she said. "Yes," I said. "I think we're okay." Judge Reyes issued her ruling 18 days after the hearing. Franklin called me on a Tuesday morning. I was in the garden, and I sat down on the bench under the oak tree to take the call. The ruling was 31 pages. The deed transfer was declared void ab initio, from the beginning, as though it had never occurred. The fraudulent nature of the signature was confirmed, adopting Dr. Voss's expert findings in full. The sale to the Cook family was invalidated, with the court ordering that the proceeds held in escrow be distributed accordingly. A full refund to the Cooks, with additional damages for their relocation costs and distress, to be paid by Dennis Harlow and Kristen Daly jointly. The property was mine, title restored to Margaret Ann Harlow, sole owner, as it had been since 2007. "There's one more thing," Franklin said. The district attorney's office had been monitoring the civil proceedings. Based on the judge's findings, a criminal referral had been made. The DA was proceeding with charges: deed fraud, forgery of a legal document, and financial fraud, the last carrying a maximum sentence of 5 years in Oregon. "What about Kristen?" "Named as co-conspirator. Her exposure is significant." I sat under the oak tree for a long time after the call ended. The tree had shed most of its leaves, and the light came through the branches in the particular way it does in November, thin and clear and very still. I had lived under this tree my entire life. No one was going to take it. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. Dennis's leverage was gone. His ability to threaten or obstruct had collapsed in a Multnomah County courtroom, and what remained was paperwork. He received the contents of our joint savings account, his retirement funds, and the furniture he had removed to the residence inn. He received nothing from the house, nothing from my parents' estate. I did not attend the finalization. Franklin represented my interests. I was in my garden. The Cook family was made entirely whole by the court. Melissa sent me a note through Franklin's office saying she was sorry and hoped I was well. I wrote back the same. They had been used, as I had been, and their culpability was zero. Dennis's criminal case concluded the following year. He pleaded guilty to deed fraud and forgery. The financial fraud charge was reduced as part of the plea. He was sentenced to 18 months supervised probation, a substantial fine, community service, and a permanent record that precluded any future work in financial services or real estate. Kristen accepted a plea on the financial fraud conspiracy charge. She paid restitution, lost her position at the insurance firm, and received probation. I will be honest. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt, standing in my house on the day the divorce was finalized, was something quieter and more durable. Something closer to the feeling you have when a window has been properly shut and the house is warm again after a long, cold draft. I changed the art in the hallway. I got rid of the kitchen table, not out of anger, but because I wanted a table that held only its own history, and bought a new one, round, from a woman in Lake Oswego who made furniture from reclaimed wood. Claire helped me carry in the chairs. Franklin sent a bottle of wine. Doris brought a casserole. The oak tree was bare, and the garden was put to bed for winter, and the house was mine, in a way it had always legally been, and now simply was in every other sense too. The spring after the divorce, I planted the largest garden I had ever planted in my life. 40 tulip bulbs along the front walk, put in during October at the height of everything, came up in April as though they had been waiting patiently for the right moment. A kitchen garden along the south fence, tomatoes, basil, runner beans, the small Persian cucumbers Claire has loved since she was a child. I put in a climbing rose along the back wall, pale yellow, the kind my mother had grown before she and my father moved to Clover Hill. I had never grown one before. I figured it was time. Claire took a position with an engineering firm downtown that spring and found an apartment 15 minutes away. Thursday dinners, Sunday farmers markets. It was the most time we had spent in the same city since she left for college in 1999. I rejoined the book club. I started a history reading group at the library that within a year had 14 members. I found that I had opinions about a great many things I had been keeping pleasantly to myself for years. In October, Doris and I took 2 weeks through the Cotswolds and up into Yorkshire. We laughed more in those 2 weeks than I had laughed in the preceding several years combined. We booked the same trip for the following spring. I found, quite good at being alone. The house held differently with just me in it, not emptily, but with clarity. I sat in the evenings with books and tea and felt consistently, entirely at ease. Dennis was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Gresham, where we had rented together in 1989. His record made the insurance career untenable. I hope he was present for his father's decline, because that part deserved kindness. Kristen Daly left Portland. I did not wish her ill. I wished her simply elsewhere, which is where she was. In September, I enrolled in a watercolor class. No particular talent, but considerable patience. The more useful quality, it turns out. By December, I had painted 6 small pictures. The best one was the oak tree in November, bare against a gray sky. I framed it and hung it where Dennis's golf photos had been. If there is one lesson in all of this, it is simple. The people who believe you are not paying attention are always making a very large bet on a very thin assumption. Know your own name on your own documents. Know what you own. Do not confuse kindness with inattention. If you ever find strangers on your porch holding keys to your home, smile, let them in, and call your attorney. What would you have done? I would genuinely like to know. leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.